Hey, everybody. How's it going this evening? Ben, good to see you. Jeff and Jill, glad you are here. Cheryl sitting next to me. Cheryl was about as sick as I've seen her in our marriage this past weekend and had a video visit and got an antibiotic. And the next day she's all but recovered. So we're happy about that. And somehow I didn't get sick. It's a miracle in and of itself. Janice, good to see you. Sue from St. Jomo, glad to have you here. Luana, good evening. Let's see who we've got over on YouTube. Mike and Terry from Indiana are with us. Jeff's visiting over on YouTube as well. Good to have you guys. We've got some other people watching too. Glad to have you this evening. Curtis, good to see you, brother. Hope you're doing okay. Linda, hope you and Larry are well. He gave up. You see him. Sophia's sound asleep on Cheryl's lap, and Julius is all the way across the room pouting. First snow last night, Sue from Missouri says. It's been cold here, but thankfully no snow. Yeah, they're starting to get along really well, but I think he's a little jealous of the attention. Or he might just be worn out. They were playing pretty good for quite some time before we started tonight, so hey buddy. Nope, he was pouting. Anyway, Ben says arf arf to you both. They're very impressed, Ben. Hey, David Clay over on YouTube. Julius doesn't show a whole lot of jealousy, to be honest. He does pretty good. Only thing he's not doing right now is sharing his food, but that's okay because they're eating different foods, so. They're pretty cute. Yeah, Misty is still in the hospital waiting to have either an ECG or an EKG done. I think an ECG. And that's the only thing keeping her there right now. So she's hoping they'll get it done tomorrow and she'll get to go home. Hey, Susan. Hope you're doing okay. Good to see you. If you want to get your Bibles ready, we are going to be starting at Luke chapter 5, verse 27. That's where we're going to start tonight. And we'll see how far we get. Luke 6 is pretty dense. It's the passage of scripture known as the Sermon on the Plain, as opposed to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. It's a much shorter version of it, like a fourth of the size, but it's pretty dense as well, but we'll see how far we get. We'll get where we get, and we won't throw a fit. Just to Jenna says to pray for D. She has had a kidney transplant with some problems. Earlier, her husband had a pancreatic transplant. We will be praying for D. Butch, good to see you. Hope you and Lainey are doing well this evening. One story I want to remind you of, because assuming that I get to that part today or remember where it's at, there'll be an interesting Greek word study involved. Remember we had the story last time of the paralytic man who was paralyzed on the bed, and there were so many people they couldn't get him to Jesus, so they lowered him down through the roof. We had that story, and Jesus told the man, your sins are forgiven. And they all said, who does Jesus think he is that he can forgive sins? And he says, you're grumbling because you think I can, or because I claim that I can forgive sins, but to show you that I can forgive sins, I'll heal this man. And he heals him. And we talked about that dichotomy, and also not even the dichotomy, but the harmony, really, of Jesus healing sin and healing people and restoring them to society. So that we had that last week. Just kind of keep that story on the back of your minds as we move into our study this evening, which I think we will go ahead and get started on. Kim is over on YouTube. Good to see you there too. All right, so we are on Luke chapter 5, verse 27. The heading is Jesus calls Levi. And this is, there's some interesting things to talk about here, but Jesus calls Levi. After this, this being healing the paralytic that they lowered down through the roof. Dorothy Collier, good to see you. Glad you're here. After this, they went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he got up and left everything and followed him. Hey, Jimmy, good to see you. So that's typical of Jesus, right? His command to his disciples is follow me. And Levi's response is the same as as far as we know, of Peter and Andrew and James and John. He just left everything and followed him. So, give me just a second. Little maintenance here. I've got a new hoodie, and because my head is basically Velcro, it gets all that stuff. Did I get it? But this, I see like this spot right here. Yeah. Well, okay. It's just I'll get a hat next time. Okay. So Levi, and I'll tell you what's interesting about that, what I think is interesting about that in just a minute. But the first thing Levi does is gives a great banquet for him in his house. There was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table with them. The Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to the disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Jesus answered, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And of course, the tongue-in-cheek part of this here is Jesus knows that there is nobody there who is truly righteous. The scribes and the Pharisees are the ones who think that they're righteous, but in fact, really, they need to repent as much, if not more, than the others. It kind of reminds me of our C.S. Lewis class that I'm teaching on Sunday mornings. We're all placed in situations, and what we do with our situations is what God judges us on. So somebody who's born into poverty and into I won't get too much into that, but if you're in that class, and several of you are, you might recognize that the Pharisees and the scribes had everything going for them, and had very little to overcome. And the fact that they couldn't overcome the little that they had to overcome, Jesus was never too fond of that particular situation, as we find towards the end of Jesus' ministry when he starts calling them out, literally calling them out for being hypocrites. So a couple things about this banquet. You might say, why would Levi have invited the tax collectors and the Pharisees, or sorry, the Pharisees and the scribes anyway? He was a tax collector, so he might have invited some of his tax collector friends. He probably would have. But he probably wouldn't have invited the scribes and the Pharisees. So the deal is, culturally, when they had big banquets like this, there were those who were invited and they would sit down and eat, but it was something to watch as well. And so other people would come and sit around and they would watch the banquet. They would listen for the teachings and those kind of things. And if you'll recall, as I've talked about before, the Pharisees and scribes' offices were directly above the teaching steps because they always wanted to keep an eye and an ear on what was being taught to make sure that it was, not heresy, that it was in line with Levitical law and cultural law of the Israelites. And so I think in a similar way, they would have been there listening to Jesus, to make sure that he wasn't speaking blasphemy or teaching things that they didn't approve of, which of course he never blasphemed, but he said things they didn't approve of, which we'll get to pretty quickly here this evening, in fact. So that's why the Pharisees and the scribes are around. And then what Jesus says is kind of what he says when he talks about the lost sheep and the lost coin and the prodigal son. This overarching message that it's just the sick people who need the physician. Nobody well even bothers to go to the physician. But again, it's really tongue in cheek because he knows that the Pharisees and the scribes are anything but righteous. And so they're all sitting around and eating, and the Pharisees and the scribes decide to ask Jesus a question. They said to Jesus, John's disciples, like the disciples of the Pharisees, frequently fast and pray, but your disciples eat and drink. Jesus said to them, you cannot make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? The days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and sews it onto an old garment, otherwise the new garment will be torn, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins and be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And then a third example, no one after drinking old wine desires new wine, but says the old is good. So 3 different little parts of this parable, all with the same message, sort of about the old versus the new. This is the only place in the entirety of the New Testament that questions the value of fasting or signals a change in the place and practice of fasting in Christian devotion. Of course, Luke makes the question, tells the question from the disciples that it's about fasting and prayer, but Jesus only answers with the fasting part because I think he probably felt like the prayer part was undeserved. The disciples certainly prayed, and Jesus was constantly praying. But, other than the 40 days that he was in the desert, there's there's not talk of Jesus fasting. And so this was something new to them. In fact, there were a lot of different days of fasting in the time of the Israelites. They had special days when they had to fast. Um, the day of fasting used to be the Day of Atonement, and then later they added extra days for a variety of reasons, including penance, mourning, and that's a big one. Fasting while you're in mourning, reinforcement of prayer, divination, preparation for divine revelation. All these things are things that I think Jesus is saying are no longer necessary. It's not a time to mourn. When Jesus is there with them, there's nothing to mourn. And he says as much when he says that the guests at a wedding banquet don't fast when the bridegroom is with them. And he's not overtly saying that he is the groom and we are the bride, but that's the first place he's alluding to it. He's certainly foreshadowing the analogy, the metaphor that will be used later on. So I think everything else is kind of self-explanatory. The part about wine, new wine is still fermenting, and so if you put new wine into old skins that don't have any stretch left to them, when the new wine goes in there, it'll ferment and expand, and the skins would burst, and you would lose both the what's going in and the thing that it's going into, which is something that nobody wanted to do. So the challenge of all of these things really is to see Jesus and his new teachings as a new garment that can't be used to patch up the old, or as a new wine that will require new wineskins. And so the people who took offense at Jesus' disciples not fasting were stuck in the old. They weren't understanding that in Jesus something new had come, and they were unable to distinguish the old from the new. So they were too stuck on the old wine to be interested in the new wine, basically. Another interesting fact here. Let me find my notes for this so that I can. Oh man. Okay, I'll just give it to you as I recall it. Okay. I know what it's coming up. Give me just a minute and we'll get there. Okay, so that's this question about fasting that really doesn't come up anywhere else in the New Testament, but it comes up here in Luke's gospel. And again, the whole idea is that what Jesus is offering is something new, and that the people who were still bringing up the old things weren't understanding the new things. Sort of, and we'll get into a little bit of this, although it's more of a Matthew Sermon on the Mount kind of thing. But it's all the places where Jesus reminds them that he didn't come to abolish the law, but came to fulfill the law, to bring meaning to the law. All those places where he said things like, "You've heard it said, love your enemy and hate," or sorry, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say love your enemies as well. We're going to get something very similar to that in just a minute as we continue in Luke. But it's Jesus' way of saying, you've heard all these old things, but I've come to tell you that you've taken the letter of the law and you've completely missed the spirit of the law, and I'm here to teach you the spirit of the law. So this is Luke's portion and of that. Hey, Ruben, great to see you. Hope you're doing okay this evening. I need a still helmet for a lot of different reasons, Curtis. You are definitely not wrong. All right, so let's move on. Make sure I didn't miss anything that I really wanted to get to. Oh, there was a note here. There's a lot of places. I said there's no other place in the New Testament that mentions fasting, but there are a lot of places that talk about food, aren't there? Jesus uses parables where food is mentioned, and he's having dinner at people's houses all the time, and they talk about that. He's having a meal when they drop the man through the roof. He's tells the parable of the bridegroom throwing a party for festival and nobody for a wedding, and nobody can come. He's always eating, and that in and of itself marked a change. And the meals of ministry. Hey, Carol King Wansley, awesome to see you. I'm glad you're here with us this evening. I hope you're doing okay. The meals during the ministry of Jesus were part of the ritual and memory of the early church in the way that it observed meals. So in the early uh, the early part of the church that would come after Jesus died, eating was very important. In fact, in the book of Acts, which again is written by Luke, we'll find that one of the things that the disciples spent their time doing was breaking bread with one another. So they had fellowship meals together, eating together. And so in that eating together and not fasting became the way in which the church remembered Jesus and declared the coming of the kingdom. So it was by eating together that they experienced fellowship, not by fasting together. And aren't you glad, as good potluck loving Methodists, that that's the case? Otherwise, we would have a fifth Sunday fast where we just sat around and didn't eat and tried not to talk about how hungry we were. So this was a change, and the early church really picked up on it. And then I think we have the birth of the casserole hangs on the balance of the church fellowshipping together. So that's good for us. Okay. The one thing I said I thought was interesting. Well, let's go on just a little bit more. Yeah, I have a lot I want to talk about tonight, but I want to go in a certain order. So let's continue with scripture. So now we're in Luke chapter 6, verse 1. One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked some some heads of grain, rubbed them in their hands, and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" So let's be very clear about here. They're not breaking any laws in terms of stealing, for example. It was permissible to go into someone's grain field and pick their grain and eat it or cook with it, whatever they did with the grains, as long as they didn't use a scythe or a sickle to harvest it. If they were just using their hands, that was allowed. And if you remember back in the book of Ruth, I think it's explicitly stated there, but if not, it comes up in discussion of it. Farmers would often leave a tenth of their field unharvested just for the people who were coming through and needed food to eat. So once they had harvested, people would go through the 90% that had been harvested and pick what they had missed, but they would have 10% of a tithe of the good food that they could go through and eat too. That was a way that they shared hospitality. And in fact, we talk about the early church. We're talking about the century after Jesus' death, but I was just thinking back to the early parts of our history that we're talking about: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, how hospitality was such an enormous part of their existence. Abraham especially, and how he forged relationships and alliances through hospitality. So this notion of hospitality and eating together is something that goes way back through the history of the Israelites. So anyway, it's Sunday. They don't have food. Remember, man is not falling from heaven at this point, but we've got these laws in place. It was against the rule of the Sabbath as they understood it. Okay, and again, it's their understanding that is often wrong because they're interested in the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law, right? Because keep the Sabbath holy, which is one of the big commandments, right? Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, was interpreted as you can't do any work during that time. And they were so legalistic that that's all they cared about. They would rather people go hungry than break the letter of the law, which obviously is not what the spirit of the law was, as Jesus explains, which is why Jesus allowed them to do this in the first place. And so Jesus answers them and says, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and gave some to his companions. So there's precedent for what Jesus is doing. And again, pointing out that it's the spirit of the law that matters, and God would not want people to go hungry. They weren't doing anything to violate the Sabbath. They weren't not keeping it holy by eating. And then he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now here we don't get Matthew's version of it, which I like better, which is where he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath is something that God gave to us. God rested after 6 days of creation. And so that gift of rest is passed on to God. In fact, the gift of rest is the ultimate gift. The gift of crossing over into the promised land where they could rest was the ultimate gift they were looking for. Even the quote unquote punishment of not letting Moses cross over to the promised land, God still gave him rest. When right before David decides he's going to build a house for God, in 2 Samuel, we read that God had given David rest from his enemies. So this gift of rest is a gift from God to be used, to be received as a gift, not to be interpreted as a restriction. So while Jesus is saying the same thing, he says it in a different way in the book of Luke. He simply says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So you can't tell me what I can't and can't do on the Sabbath. I'm Lord over the Sabbath. And they don't like that, by the way. Turns out that Pharisees and scribes who think they know everything don't like it when people tell them that they're wrong. And so we have another story about the Sabbath. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath so that they might find an accusation against him. So in Luke, this is where it begins. In other gospel stories, sort of the conspiracy to contain and ultimately crucify Jesus comes later in his ministry. In Matthew, it comes after the woe to the Pharisees passage that I mentioned before. The 7 times he screams, woe to the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. That's after that point, they said it was time for Jesus to die. But here it's pretty early. They're already looking for, again, they don't like being told that they're wrong. So now they know that Jesus is going around healing people. And so they've got this withered man who's in the synagogue, maybe even placed there as a test. Who knows? But they want to see if he'll cure on the Sabbath so that they can find an accusation against him. Even though he knew what they were thinking, Jesus always does, he said to the man who had the withered hand, come and stand here. He got up and stood there. Jesus then said to them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or destroy it? After looking around at all of them, I guess they didn't have an answer, he said to him, stretch out your hand. He did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do with Jesus. So again, they're looking for a way to take Jesus down because this all flows together so nicely. He's telling them their old ways are changing and something new is coming. And if you've ever been in a church before, you know that groups of people, even those who love God, don't like it when new things take over old things as a general rule. This is actually just part of family systems theory. The organization, the system is always resistant to change. But for the scribes and Pharisees, they spent their entire lives learning how to read and write so that they could learn the law, so that they could explain the law. This was their livelihood. This was, in their mind, their calling. This was their reason for being. And Jesus was saying, your very reason for being is not completely right because you're focused on this legalistic letter of the law interpretation. And I've come to tell you that there's more to it than that. And so once they find that out, they're already beginning to look for ways to get rid of Jesus. And so this test they have where they have this man with a withered hand in the synagogue as Jesus is teaching on the Sabbath. He doesn't just heal the man, but he calls them out on it before he does it. So Jesus is I mean, what can I tell you that you don't already know? He's brave. He doesn't care what other people think. He does what's right because it's what's right. And that is, if you were in church last week, you will know that as imitators of Christ, that is the kind of person that we are called to be as well. All right, on to the next session, which is where I'm going to bring up I probably hyped it up more than I should have, but there's this interesting little biblical thing here that I think is neat. Luke 12. Now, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James and John. Okay, those are the four main ones. We know them, especially Peter and James and John. Those are the inner circle of Jesus. And Philip and Bartholomew. Those six are really the most well-known of the disciples, probably. Other than, well, I'll take that back. We certainly know some of these others. Matthew and Thomas we know very well. And James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who is called the Zealot. So this isn't Simon Peter, this is another Simon, the Zealot. And Judas, son of James, which was not the Judas that we think of when we think of this last disciple he mentions, Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And interesting, Luke is the only person who, when he's describing the disciples and the calling of the disciples, he's the only person who preemptively tells us that Judas is the one who becomes a traitor. Again, Luke kind of lays everything out on the line from the start. There's no secret that he's trying to hide. He wants everybody to know everything from the start. So it's much more of a, there's a word that I can't think of right now because I'm trying to think of it, but it's just much more of a direct kind of, here's what I'm going to tell you, and here it is. So he just lays it out on the line. Now, I think what's interesting here, and the interesting little thing, is that we just had this story not too long ago that after this, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth and said to him, "Follow me." And he got up, left everything, and followed him. But Levi is not mentioned down here in this group of disciples. But Matthew is mentioned, and Matthew is a tax collector also, which we know. And so there's a question about whether Levi might have been called as a disciple but not an apostle, or whether Levi and Matthew are the same people. We don't know the answer here. Julius, stop. Just open that up. He wants to go down. So again, I hype that up a little bit more. I'm a biblical geek, and so I enjoy little puzzles like this. So we don't know exactly who Levi is. It's very possible that Matthew is another name for Levi. So Julius is being very annoying right now. Okay. Hang on. All right, excuse me. One of those difficulties of working from home. Okay, we're going to keep going a little bit here. Oh, there was, I guess this is interesting. It's extra biblical. It's extra biblical. It's not part of the Bible, but there was a later rabbinic tradition that one could heal on the Sabbath when faced with a life-threatening condition. And whenever there's doubt that life might be in danger, that overrides the Sabbath. So even in the early church, when they sort of became legalistic again and kind of lost their ways, they would still heal if it were life threatening. And so I I think that it's important to note that this withered hand that this man had was not life threatening. If something had been life threatening, it would have lessened their ability to go after Jesus. Okay, so I think I've got some more notes about the Sabbath, but I think we've really kind of gone through that. And now we've talked about the calling of the 12. I'm going to say a few more things about that, and then we're going to stop because Luke 6:17 is where we start the Sermon on the Plain. It says he came down with them and stood on a level place. So that's how it got the name, the Sermon on the Plain. And I want to save all that for one session. So let's go back to the Sabbath, because this is, Matthew has much more of a focus on this idea that I've been speaking about, that Jesus came to kind of teach people the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law, to teach them that it's not about being legalistic. It's not about following a set of rules. It's about understanding why the rules are there, and then going, not just going as far as the rule tells you to go, but to go even further. We'll get some of that in the Sermon on the Plains. There will be the part about if someone, I think this is the one where it says if someone steals your shirt, give them your cloak also, and turn the other cheek, and those things are in here. But in Matthew, we get these very easy to follow. You've heard it said, but I say unto you. And when he says you've heard it said, he quotes one of the Levitical laws, sometimes even one of the 10 Commandments, and then says, but I say to you. And so he takes he looks at the letter of the law, and from that determines what the spirit of the law, what it was intended to do, and then says, in the context that we are in today, this is what that means. And in many cases, it's antithetical to what the letter of the law said, like love your neighbor and hate your enemies. That was in the Levitical law. And Jesus says that's not the case. Actually, I'll walk that back and say it's not necessarily one of the Levitical laws, because I don't think it is, but it was definitely a law that they abided by at the time. It was part of the culture. So with that in mind, I think that this healing on the Sabbath warrants just a little more discussion. And so I'm going to talk about it just a little bit more since I've got some time, and we're going to get into the Sermon on the Plain next week. So we look at who's here. The scribes and the Pharisees are present, right, to see whether or not he would heal on the Sabbath so that they could have something to accuse him about. And the crippled man is there, right? As he's defined, this man with this withered hand is there, and Jesus is there. So we have three different points of view, which allows the reader to interpret the scene, the listener, as it would have been from the start, and the reader now today from three different various perspectives. And I think this is important. Again, I've always preached that the importance of reading the Bible isn't just to read it as a historical document, but it's to actually find yourself in the story. That's the challenge, is to find yourself in the stories that you're reading. And here we've got three different people that we can identify with. We can identify with the scribes and the Pharisees. We can identify with the man who's got the withered hand, or we can identify with Jesus, who's willing to do something that somebody doesn't want him to do because he knows it's the right thing to do. So, from the man with the withered hand, Jesus is a potential healer or a source of hope, while the scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus poses an obstacle or a threat to their way of life. From Jesus' point of view, each of the other parties represent a competing priority, and this is kind of what I want to dig into just a touch, whether to heal the man or to keep the Sabbath, therefore complying with the scribes and the Pharisees' interpretation of the Sabbath observations taking precedence, since the man's condition isn't necessarily life-threatening. In the same way, the Pharisees are faced with a choice, right? Jesus is faced with that choice. The Pharisees are faced with the choice, which is how are they observing the Sabbath? As Jesus asked them, are they observing it by doing good or by doing evil? Specifically, while Jesus is seeking to do something good, are they not doing something evil? They are trying to, Jesus is good. We know Jesus is good. And so they are trying to find a reason to punish a good man for doing a good thing. And so he's basically saying that what they're doing, while he's going to do something good, what they're doing in watching him do something good is something evil in and of themselves. They're seeking to destroy him, Jesus, while he's seeking to heal the man. So there's a lot of this tension that's going on, but ultimately, both of these Sabbath stories and other parts that we'll read later in the book of Luke, and something that we can keep our eyes on, is this tension between value and duty. So what is your duty? What is your responsibility? And what values are you pursuing? In Jesus' mind here, the value he was pursuing was that he came out to seek and save the lost. He came to restore people to society. And again, if the man's hand was withered, then people would assume that it was withered because he had done something bad and he would have been an outcast in regular society. So by healing that hand, then people would not associate this man with wrongdoing, and he was restored to society. That's the value that Jesus had. And Jesus always pursues his values. He's not concerned with breaking the letter of the law, as long as he's following the spirit of the law. As long as he's following his values, he's less concerned with, or not concerned at all with, what human beings have decided that their duty is. And so both these Sabbath controversies set God's command to observe the Sabbath in conflict with the command to love one's neighbor, right? I think there's a question about what does it mean to observe the Sabbath? That, is the healing of this man and restoring him to society not in and of itself a holy thing? And I think that's where the discrepancy is. For Jesus, it was a holy thing, and so he was able to do that. Whereas for the Pharisees, they weren't worried about that. They weren't worried about values. They weren't worried about the spirit of the law. They were focused on the letter of law because that's what they were good at. That's what they knew. That's what their livelihood depended on. And that's what they didn't want to change. And that's ultimately what leads Jesus to the cross. So in this case, this idea of whether observing the Sabbath or loving one's neighbor, when those two things are in conflict, which takes precedence? The duty of the Sabbath rest or the duty to feed the hungry and heal the sick? Can the love of God be separated from or juxtaposed with the love of neighbor, or is the love of neighbor an expression of our love of God? Is Jesus not expressing his love for God? Is he not keeping the Sabbath holy when he uses the gifts that he's given to heal a man? That's the underlying ultimate, sort of the bottom of the archaeological dig that we get to when we see these stories about the Sabbath. They seem kind of like they're just throwaway stories that are just about the Pharisees not liking Jesus. But as we actually see, it brings to surface, and I think it will lead very nicely into what we talk about when we talk about the Sermon on the Plain and the things that Jesus teaches. It brings us nicely into this understanding about legalism and the letter of the law versus spiritualism and the spirit of the law. Okay? Everybody good with that? Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. Anybody else? Any questions, thoughts? Jimmy, let Misty know that we spoke about her in all good ways, and we're lifting her up in prayer, hoping that her test is results are good tomorrow and that she gets to come home. I know she does not want to be in the hospital. So we've been praying for her and for you. All right, everybody. Well, that's going to be it for tonight then. So next week we will begin with the Sermon on the Plain, and we'll see where we get to. So as always, God bless, Godspeed, and from the bottom of my heart, thanks for watching.